They handed him 2 human lives and called it a reward, and by sunrise the whole town would be watching to see what kind of man he truly was. So before we go any further, tell me where you're listening from. Because out here, stories travel farther than horses, and some truths ride quieter than justice itself. Now listen close, because this one doesn't begin with a gunshot. It begins with silence. The kind that settles over dry earth when something ain't right. The kind Elias Boone knew better than most. He was a man who kept to himself, a weathered rancher living 20 miles from the nearest town, where the wind spoke louder than people and the dust carried more memory than words. His cabin stood alone under a wide Texas sky, boards faded, roof creaking, a place built for one man and one man only, and Elias liked it that way. No debts, no favors, no ties left to break. But that morning, the quiet didn't feel the same. It felt watched, like the land itself was holding its breath. He heard the horses before he saw them, hooves cutting slow across hard ground, not in a hurry, not in fear, just steady, deliberate, like men who believed they owned whatever waited at the end of their ride. Elias stepped out onto his porch, boots settling into the dust, one hand resting near his belt, not ready, just aware. The sun sat low behind the riders as they approached, turning them into shadows first, then shapes, then men. 3 of them, hats low, faces unreadable, and behind them, tied across 2 saddles, were figures that didn't move like cargo, didn't sag like sacks of grain. They shifted, barely, breathing, alive. And when the riders stopped 10 feet from the porch, one of the men tipped his hat just enough to show a grin that didn't belong in any decent place. Payment, he said, like it was a word that explained everything, and before Elias could answer, they pulled the 2 figures down from the horses and set them on the ground. Not rough, not gentle either, just placed, like objects being delivered, like something that had already been decided. And that's when Elias saw them clearly. 2 young women, sisters by the look of them, same dark hair, same quiet eyes, wrists bound with leather ties, dust clinging to their clothes. But it wasn't fear on their faces that struck him. It was the absence of anything else. No pleading, no anger, just stillness. The kind that comes when a person has already measured the worst and found nothing left to say. The taller one kept her gaze low. The other looked up once, just once, meeting Elias's eyes for half a second before looking away, not in submission, not in shame, just distance, like she was already somewhere he couldn't reach. The man on the horse chuckled softly. Job's done, Boone. Figured you earned something worth keeping. And the others laughed under their breath. But Elias didn't laugh, didn't move, didn't even blink right away. He just stood there, looking at the rope around their wrists, the way it cut into the dust on their skin, the way it didn't belong there. Not on anyone, not for any reason. The wind picked up then, carrying the smell of dry grass and leather, brushing past all 4 of them like it was trying to erase the moment before it settled too deep. They're yours now, the rider added, like a final stamp on a deal that couldn't be undone. And then they turned their horses without waiting for thanks, without asking questions, because men like that didn't need answers. They rode off the same way they came, slow, certain, leaving behind 2 lives in the dirt and a silence that felt heavier than anything Elias had carried in years. He didn't step forward right away, didn't reach for the rope, didn't speak. He just stood there, boots planted, watching the dust settle around them. And the sisters didn't move either. They stayed where they'd been left, like the ground beneath them had already claimed them, like standing up would mean something worse than staying down. Time stretched, long enough for the sun to climb a little higher, long enough for the shadows to shift across the porch, long enough for Elias Boone to feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not anger, not pity, something quieter, heavier, like memory pressing against his ribs. And finally, he took 1 step forward, then another, slow, careful, stopping just out of reach. The leather ties were close enough now that he could see the wear on them. Old, reused, like they'd served this purpose before, and that thought sat wrong in his chest, real wrong. One of the sisters shifted slightly, not away from him, not toward him, just enough to remind him they were still breathing, still here, still waiting for something. And that's when the smaller one spoke, her voice low, rough from dust and silence. Just 2 words, barely carried by the wind. What now? And Elias didn't answer, not because he didn't hear her, but because out here, in a place where everything had a price and most men paid it without thinking, he was starting to understand that whatever came next wasn't about ownership or reward or what the town would say when they found out. It was about something a whole lot harder to hold on to, something no man could be handed, bought, or taken. And as the sun climbed higher and the land stayed quiet, Elias Boone realized this wasn't a gift, it was a test, and he hadn't decided yet what kind of man he was going to be when it ended. The wind did not change, but something in the air felt tighter, like the land itself was waiting to see what Elias Boone would do next, and he knew better than to rush a moment like that, because out here, the wrong move did not just cost you sleep, it stayed with you. So he crouched slowly, not close enough to startle them, not far enough to pretend they were not there, and he studied the leather ties again. The way they had been pulled, just firm enough to control, not enough to injure. Practical, efficient, thoughtless, the kind of work done by men who did not see people when they looked down, and that sat wrong with him, real wrong. The taller sister shifted her weight, the movement small but deliberate, as if reminding him she still had a choice somewhere inside her, even if the rope said otherwise, and Elias noticed her breathing, steady, controlled, not panicked, not broken, which told him something else entirely. These were not women who had given up, these were women who were waiting, measuring, deciding, just like he was, and that made the silence between them feel less like emptiness and more like a standoff without guns. The smaller one kept her eyes lowered, but not in fear, more like she was listening to something deeper than the moment, something inside herself that told her when to move and when to stay still. And Elias had seen that kind of stillness before, long ago, in a different place, with someone he had not been able to help in time. The memory came without warning, sharp and quiet. A porch not unlike this one, a woman standing in the doorway with the same look in her eyes, not asking for rescue, not expecting it either, just waiting to see what kind of man stood in front of her. And Elias had turned away back then, told himself it was not his fight, told himself staying out of it was the smart choice. And that decision had followed him longer than any trail he had ever ridden. So now, standing here again with 2 lives placed at his feet like something earned, he felt that old weight pressing against his chest, heavier than the sun climbing overhead, heavier than the dust settling around them. He reached forward at last, slow, giving them time to react, his fingers stopping just short of the rope, not touching yet, just close enough to feel the heat of it. And the smaller sister looked up then, not fully, just enough for her eyes to meet his again. And this time there was something in them, not fear, not hope, something harder to name, something like a question she was not willing to ask out loud. And Elias understood that question without needing words, because he had asked it himself once. What kind of man are you when no one is forcing your hand? He swallowed slowly, the taste of dust dry in his mouth, and instead of cutting the rope, instead of making a choice too soon, he pulled his hand back and stood up again, the movement deliberate, careful, and he stepped aside from them, not toward the cabin, not toward the open land, just away enough to show he was not going to claim space that was not his. The taller sister noticed that, her head tilting slightly, just enough to show she was paying attention now. And the shift between them was small but real. The air no longer felt like it was holding its breath. Now it felt like it was listening. Elias walked to the edge of the porch and picked up the tin cup sitting on the railing, filled it from the water barrel, and set it down on the step between them, not handing it, not offering it directly, just placing it there like something they could choose to take or leave. And then he stepped back again, giving distance, giving time, because some things could not be rushed, not trust, not dignity, not the kind of decision that stayed with a man for the rest of his life. The smaller sister was the first to move, slow, careful. She leaned forward and took the cup, her hand still bound, making the motion awkward, but she managed, bringing it to her lips without looking at him, drinking just enough to ease the dryness, then lowering it again, and passing it to her sister without a word. The taller one drank next, her eyes never leaving Elias this time, watching him the way someone watches a storm to see if it is going to break or pass. And Elias did not look away, because he knew looking away would mean something he did not want it to mean. The sun climbed higher, the heat settling over them, stretching the moment longer, and from somewhere far off, he heard the faint echo of hooves, distant but real, not coming fast, not yet, but coming all the same, and Elias knew what that meant. The men who had left would not be the last to take interest in what had been delivered to his door. The town would hear. The whispers would spread, and sooner or later, someone would come to see if Elias Boone was the kind of man they thought he was, or something else entirely. And as he stood there between two bound sisters and an open horizon, he realized the choice was no longer waiting for him. It was already here, sitting in the dust, breathing, watching, asking without words. And whatever he did next would not just decide their fate. It would decide whether the man he had been was the man he was going to remain. The sound of hooves did not grow louder, but it did not fade either. And that was enough to tell Elias Boone everything he needed to know about the hours ahead. Trouble out here did not rush unless it had to. It moved steady, patient, like it knew time was on its side. And Elias had lived long enough to recognize that rhythm. He turned his head slightly toward the horizon, not enough to alarm the sisters, just enough to confirm what his ears were already telling him. Riders, more than one, keeping their distance for now, watching, waiting, and that meant the choice in front of him was no longer private. Whatever he did next would be seen, measured, talked about in low voices across the town. And Elias had spent years building a life where no one had anything to say about him. A quiet life, a simple one. The kind of man could live without owing anyone anything. But that kind of life did not come without cost. It meant walking away when things turned complicated. It meant staying silent when speaking up would pull you into something bigger than yourself. And Elias had told himself that was the only way to survive out here. But standing on that porch now, with the dust warm under his boots and two bound sisters sitting in the space where his silence used to live, he felt that belief starting to crack, just a little. The taller sister shifted again, this time pushing herself up slowly, not fully standing, just lifting enough to change her position, testing the ground beneath her, testing him. And Elias did not stop her, did not step forward. He let her move at her own pace, because forcing anything now would break whatever fragile line they were holding between them. The smaller sister followed, slower, her movements careful with the rope still binding her wrists, and when they both settled into a kneeling position instead of sitting in the dust, something about the scene changed. They no longer looked like something left behind. They looked like something deciding. And that made Elias straighten slightly, not in authority, but in recognition. He had seen that before too. People who had nothing left except the one thing no one could take unless they gave it away themselves. Their will. The taller sister finally spoke, her voice steady despite the dryness in her throat. "You are not like them," she said, not as a compliment, not as trust, just as an observation. And Elias let the words settle before he answered. Because out here, answers carried weight, and the wrong one could close a door you did not even know you were standing near. "I do not know what they are to you," he said slowly, "but I know what they left here." And he glanced at the rope, not at them, because some truths were easier to face when you did not look a person directly in the eye. The smaller sister watched him closely now, her earlier distance replaced with something sharper, something searching, like she was trying to see past the man in front of her into whatever lived underneath. And Elias felt that look, felt it press against him the same way the memory had earlier. The one he had tried to bury under years of quiet days and empty nights. He took a breath, slow, measured, and stepped forward again, this time closing the distance, not sudden, not threatening, just enough to reach the rope without hesitation. And when his fingers finally touched the leather, he felt the roughness of it, the dryness, the way it had been pulled tight and left that way without a second thought. And something in him did not like that at all. He worked the knot carefully, not because it was difficult, but because rushing it would feel wrong, like undoing something too quickly that should have never been done in the first place. The sisters did not pull away, did not flinch. They stayed still, watching him, waiting, and that trust, small as it was, settled heavier on him than any threat ever could. The knot loosened under his fingers, the leather giving just enough to slide free, and he paused there, just for a second, the rope no longer tight, but not fully removed. Either, because this was the moment, the one that would decide everything that followed, the one that would echo louder than any gunshot ever could. And from the distance, the sound of hooves came again, closer now, clearer, the riders no longer hiding their approach, because they did not need to. They believed they already knew how this would end. Elias looked up once more toward the horizon, then back at the sisters. And in that brief exchange of silence, something passed between them. Not words, not agreement. Something simpler, something older, a recognition that whatever happened next would not belong to the men riding in from town. It would belong to the three of them standing in the dust, and Elias Boone realized then that the life he had built out here, the quiet, the distance, the safety of staying out of other people's troubles, had brought him exactly to this moment, and there was no stepping back from it now. Not without losing something he could not get back, not this time. The leather slipped free, not with a snap, not with force, just a quiet release that almost no one would notice unless they were standing close enough to feel it. And Elias Boone felt it, felt the shift in the air the same way a man feels a storm change direction before the sky even moves. The rope loosened in his hands, no longer a claim, no longer a mark, just a piece of worn leather that had no place where it had been. And he pulled it away fully, slow, careful, like he was undoing something that should have never been done. The sisters did not move at first, their hands still held close together out of habit, out of memory, as if the rope were still there even after it was gone, and Elias stepped back, giving them space the same way he had before, not stepping into their freedom, not claiming it, just letting it exist. The taller sister flexed her fingers slightly, testing the air, testing the absence of restraint, and the smaller one lowered her gaze to her wrists, studying them, like she was not entirely sure what she was seeing was real. And for a moment, no one spoke, because some moments do not need words. Some moments carry more weight in silence than anything a voice could add. But the sound of hooves broke through again, closer now, clearer, no longer distant enough to ignore, and Elias turned his head toward the horizon, the riders coming into view this time. 3 of them, the same men from before, but no longer in shadow. Now they rode with purpose, with expectation, like men returning to collect something they believed was already theirs, and Elias could feel the shift behind him. The sisters rising slowly to their feet now, not in panic, not in flight, just standing, side by side. Their presence no longer something placed in the dirt, but something that stood on its own, and that changed everything about how the moment felt. The riders slowed as they approached, their horses stepping lighter as they took in the scene, the rope gone, the sisters unbound, Elias standing between them and the open land, and the man in front let out a low breath, not quite a laugh, not quite surprise, just a sound that said this was not what he had expected to find. "Looks like you forgot what we left you," he called out, his voice carrying across the dry air, easy, confident, like the outcome had already been decided. Elias did not answer right away. He kept his eyes on the riders, his stance unchanged, not defensive, not welcoming, just steady, and the silence stretched again, long enough for the horses to stop, long enough for the dust to settle around their hooves, long enough for the tension to settle into something that could not be ignored. The man tilted his head slightly, studying Elias now. "You not satisfied with your reward?" he asked, and there was something in his tone, not anger, not yet, something closer to disbelief, like he could not quite understand why a man would refuse something he had been given. And Elias finally spoke, his voice low, even, carrying just enough to be heard without effort. "They are not mine," he said, and the words landed in the space between them heavier than anything else that had been said that morning. The other riders shifted slightly in their saddles, exchanging glances that carried more meaning than words, and the man in front smiled then. But it was not a kind smile, not even a real one. It was the kind of smile a man gives when he thinks he is about to correct a misunderstanding. "Everything out here belongs to someone, Boone," he said. "And today, that someone is you." And Elias shook his head once, slow, deliberate. "No," he said, and that single word carried more certainty than anything else he had spoken. The wind moved again, brushing across the space between them, lifting a thin layer of dust that swirled around their boots, and for a moment, it felt like the land itself was listening, waiting to see what would come next. The taller sister took a step back then, not away from Elias, but toward the open land behind him, and the smaller one followed, their movements quiet, controlled, not running, not yet, just preparing, and Elias did not turn to look at them, did not acknowledge the movement directly, but he shifted his stance just enough to open a path behind him, just enough to show that whatever happened next, It would not be decided by the men on horseback. The rider in front noticed that. Of course he did, and his expression changed, not into anger, but into something sharper, something more focused. "You really think you can just let them walk?" he asked, and there was no humor left in his voice now, just a question that carried weight, and Elias met his gaze without hesitation. "I am not letting anything happen," he said. "I am choosing what does not." And that answer hung there, heavy, quiet, undeniable, and for the first time since the riders had returned, the balance shifted, just slightly, just enough to change the way the moment felt, because this was no longer about a reward, no longer about ownership. It was about a man standing in the dust deciding what kind of world he was willing to be part of. And behind him, without a word, without a sound, the sisters began to move toward the open land, their steps slow at first, then steadier, and Elias Boone did not look back, because some things, once set free, did not need to be watched to be understood. The riders did not move right away, and that stillness said more than any threat could have, because men who are used to being obeyed do not expect silence in return. They expect hesitation, excuses, maybe even fear, but Elias Boone gave them none of that. He stood there as the dust drifted between them, as the sisters' footsteps faded slowly behind him, and he did not turn, not even when the sound of those steps grew softer, because he understood something now that he had spent years avoiding. Some choices lose their meaning the moment you look back, and this was not a moment he could afford to weaken. The lead rider shifted in his saddle, the leather creaking under his weight, and he let out a slow breath through his nose, the kind a man gives when he is deciding whether something is worth pushing further. "You are making this harder than it needs to be," he said, his voice calm, almost patient, like he was offering Elias a chance to correct himself. But Elias did not answer, because there was nothing left to explain. The decision had already been made, not in words, not in defiance, but in action. And out here, action was the only language that ever mattered. One of the other riders leaned slightly forward, his eyes tracking the horizon behind Elias now, following the direction the sisters had gone, and for a brief second, there was a shift in the air, a subtle tightening, as if something unseen was measuring the distance between choice and consequence. Elias noticed it. Of course he did, and he adjusted his stance just enough, not blocking, not threatening, just present, just enough to remind them that whatever they were thinking of doing next would not happen without him standing in the middle of it. The lead rider saw that too, and this time, when he smiled, it was thinner, less certain. "You think you are doing something noble," he said quietly, "but you are only turning down a gift." And Elias let those words pass through the air without catching them, because he had heard that kind of thinking before. Men calling something a gift when it costs someone else their freedom, men dressing up ownership as generosity. And he had believed it once, long ago, believed that taking what was offered without question was just part of surviving out here. But standing here now, with the sun higher, the heat pressing down, and the sound of the sisters' steps nearly gone, he understood the truth of it. Survival was not the same as living, and some things, once taken, stayed with you in ways no man could outrun. "It is not a gift," Elias said finally, his voice steady, quiet, but carrying enough to settle in the space between them. "Not if it is given without a choice." And the words hung there, simple, clear, and for a moment, no one spoke, because even the men on horseback understood that truth, whether they wanted to admit it or not. The wind moved again, lifting the edge of Elias's coat, brushing across the ground where the sisters had been, erasing the last marks of where they had sat, and that felt right somehow, like the land itself was refusing to hold on to what should not have been there in the first place. One of the riders exhaled sharply, not quite frustration, not quite acceptance, something in between, and he glanced at the lead man, waiting, because this was no longer a simple exchange. This had become something else entirely, something that could not be forced without cost, and the lead rider knew it. Elias could see it in the way his posture shifted, the way his confidence no longer sat as easily as it had before. "You are a strange man, Boone," he said after a long pause, and this time there was no mockery in his voice, just a quiet acknowledgement, like he had come up against something he did not fully understand. And Elias did not take that as a compliment, did not take it as anything at all. He simply stood there, the same as before, The same as he had been when the moment began, but not the same man inside. Not anymore. The riders lingered a second longer, just enough to make sure nothing else would change, just enough to test whether Elias would waver now that the immediate choice had passed. But he did not. He held the same line, the same silence, the same steady presence, and eventually, the lead. Ryder nodded once, a small motion, barely noticeable. But it was enough. Keep your peace. Then, he said, turning his horse slightly, not in defeat, not in surrender, just in recognition that this was no longer theirs to take. The others followed, their movements slower now, less certain than when they had arrived, and as they rode off, the sound of hooves faded once more into the distance, leaving behind the same quiet that had started it all. But it was not the same quiet, not anymore. Because something had shifted, something had been decided. Elias stood there a while longer, watching the empty horizon, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle into him. Not heavy like regret, not sharp like fear, something steadier, something that felt closer to balance. And when he finally turned, the land behind him stretched wide and open, the sisters no longer visible, just the faintest trace of their path leading away into the distance. And Elias Boone did not follow, did not call out, did not try to see where it ended, because some paths were not meant to be tracked, some choices were meant to be left alone once they were made. And as the wind moved across the open ground, carrying away the last signs of what had been, Elias stepped back onto his porch, the boards creaking under his weight, the same as they had that morning. But everything else had changed, and he knew, without needing to see it, without needing anyone to tell him, that this was not the end of the story, not for him, not for them. Because out here, the land remembered things in its own way, and sometimes, what you set free did not disappear, it found its way back, not as a debt, not as a reward, but as something else entirely. Something a man could not buy, could not earn, only deserve. The afternoon stretched long after the riders disappeared, the kind of long that settles into your bones and makes every sound carry farther than it should. And Elias Boone felt it in the way the wind dragged across the porch, slower now, heavier, like it was carrying something unseen back across the land. He sat down in his chair without thinking, the wood creaking beneath him in a familiar way, the same sound it had made every day for years. But today it did not feel the same, nothing did. The space in front of his cabin looked wider, emptier, like something had been removed that the land itself had grown used to holding. And for the first time in a long while, Elias did not reach for anything to fill that silence. He just let it sit there, let it breathe, because some silences needed time to settle into what they really meant. The sun climbed higher, then began its slow descent, and the light shifted across the ground in long, quiet lines, marking the passing hours without asking for notice. And still, Elias stayed where he was, watching nothing in particular, thinking less than he expected, feeling more than he wanted to admit. He could still see the faint path the sisters had taken earlier, though the wind had already begun to soften it, their footprints fading into the dust like they had never been there at all. And that thought might have bothered him once, the idea that something so real could disappear so quickly. But now, it felt right, because what mattered was not the marks left behind. It was the choice that had set them free in the first place, and that choice did not fade with the wind. It stayed, quiet, steady, like a stone placed deep enough that no storm could reach it. A sound broke through the stillness then, not hooves this time, something lighter, the faint creak of leather, the soft shift of weight just beyond the edge of sight. And Elias did not move right away, because out here, reacting too fast could turn something small into something worse. He waited, listening, letting the sound come to him instead of chasing it. And after a moment, he heard it again, closer now, deliberate, not hiding, not rushing, just present. And Elias pushed himself up slowly from the chair, his movements calm, unhurried, and he stepped down from the porch, boots settling into the dirt with that same familiar weight. But his attention sharper now, more focused, he turned slightly toward the side of the cabin, where the shadow stretched longer in the late afternoon light. And that was when he saw her, the smaller sister, standing just beyond the edge of the open ground, not as far as she had gone, not hidden, just waiting. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because the distance between them was not just measured in steps. It was measured in everything that had already passed between them that day, and Elias did not close that distance. He stayed where he was, letting her decide whether this was a return or simply a pause. She stepped forward then, one careful step, then another, her hands free now, resting at her sides. No rope, no mark except the faint lines on her wrists that would fade in time. And she stopped a few feet from him, her eyes meeting his without hesitation this time. And there was something different in them now, something that had not been there before, not fear, not distance, something steadier, something that looked a lot like understanding. "We could have kept walking," she said, her voice quiet but clear, and Elias nodded once, because he knew that. Had known it the moment he stepped aside earlier. "You still can," he replied, his voice just as even, and she held his gaze for a moment longer before glancing back over her shoulder, toward the horizon where the land stretched wide and open, and then she looked back at him. "My sister is further ahead," she said. She did not stop, and there was no judgment in that, no regret, just a statement of fact, and Elias understood that too. Not everyone turned back, not everyone needed to, and that did not make one choice better than the other, it just made them different. "Then you should not either," he said, and for a brief second, something in her expression shifted, something like a question she had not decided how to ask, but instead of speaking it, she reached into the fold of her clothing and pulled out something small, something that caught the light just enough to stand out against the dust and fabric, and she stepped forward one last time, placing it gently on the edge of the porch rail without handing it to him, without making it an exchange, just leaving it there, the way he had left the water earlier, a choice, not an obligation. And then she stepped back again, her movements quiet, certain. "Not everything that is given is meant to be kept," she said softly, and the words settled into the air between them with the same weight his had carried before, and Elias did not answer, because he did not need to. He had already said his part in that truth. She gave a small nod, not formal, not distant, just enough to mark the moment for what it was. And then she turned, walking back toward the open land, her steps steady, unhurried, not looking back, and Elias watched her go this time, not because he doubted the choice, but because some endings deserve to be seen all the way through. And when she finally disappeared into the distance, the land felt quiet again, but not empty, not the way it had before. Something had been left behind, something small, something that did not belong to ownership or reward. And as Elias stepped back onto the porch and looked down at what she had placed there, he realized this story was not finished, not by a long shot, because out here, the quiet did not mean nothing was coming. It meant something had already begun. The object on the porch did not look like much at first glance, just a small piece of something worn and simple, but Elias Boone knew better than to judge things by how they appeared in the light. He stepped closer, slow, deliberate, the boards beneath his boots giving that familiar creak, as the late sun stretched long shadows across the wood, and he leaned down slightly, his eyes narrowing just enough to take in the details before his hands ever touched it, because out here, small things carried stories, and stories had a way of finding their way back to the man who ignored them. It was a bracelet, leather, braided tight with careful hands, not new, not old enough to fall apart, just worn in the way something becomes part of a person's life. There were small beads threaded into it, dark red and faded blue, each one placed with intention, not decoration, something more than that, something that meant this had not been made to be traded or lost. And yet here it was, resting on his porch like it had chosen to be there. Elias reached out finally, his fingers brushing against the leather, and he felt the warmth of the day still held in it. Like it had not been long since it was worn, he picked it up slowly, turning it in his hand, studying the pattern, the way the braid tightened at one end and loosened slightly at the other, a design meant to be fastened and removed with care, not forced. And that thought settled into him in a quiet way, the same way her words had. Not everything given was meant to be kept, and yet she had left this behind, not as payment, not as a gift, something else entirely, something he had not decided how to understand yet. The wind moved across the porch again, lifting the edge of his shirt, carrying with it the faint scent of sage and dust, and for a moment, Elias stood there holding that small piece of leather like it weighed more than it should, because it did, not in ounces, not in pounds, but in meaning, and meaning had a way of staying with a man long after the moment that brought it to him had passed. He slipped the bracelet into his pocket without thinking, not claiming it, not rejecting it either, just keeping it where he could feel it. A reminder that something had changed, whether he wanted it to or not. The sun dipped lower, the light turning softer, the kind of light that made everything look quieter than it really was, and Elias moved through his usual routine without rushing, without distraction, feeding the horses, checking the fence line, making sure the water barrel was filled before the night settled in. The same things he had done every day for years, but each step carried a different weight now. Not heavier, just noticed, like he was seeing his own life from a distance for the first time. And as the sky shifted into deeper shades of orange and blue, the land grew still again, that wide, open stillness that made a man feel both alone and watched at the same time. Elias returned to the porch as the last light faded, sitting down in his chair with a slow exhale, his hand resting unconsciously over the pocket where the bracelet sat, and he let his gaze drift out across the darkening horizon, the same horizon the sisters had walked toward, now swallowed in shadow. And for a moment, he wondered where that path had taken them, not out of concern, not out of doubt, just a quiet curiosity, the kind that does not demand answers, only acknowledges that they exist somewhere beyond reach. The night settled in fully, bringing with it the cooler air and the distant sounds of the land shifting into its quieter rhythm, and Elias closed his eyes briefly, not to sleep, just to listen, to feel the space around him without needing to fill it. And that was when he heard it again, not the heavy rhythm of riders this time, not the deliberate approach of men with purpose, something softer, more distant, like a presence rather than a movement, and his eyes opened slowly, his gaze returning to the darkness beyond his land, where shapes were harder to see but easier to sense. And for a long moment, nothing happened, no figures stepped into the light, no voices called out, just the quiet, steady feeling that he was no longer the only one awake under that sky. Elias did not reach for a weapon, did not stand, did not prepare for anything the way he once would have. He simply sat there, watching, waiting, the same way the land seemed to be doing. Because whatever this was, it did not feel like something that needed to be met with force. It felt like something that needed to be understood, and that difference mattered more than anything else. The wind shifted again, carrying with it a faint sound, not words, not a call, something closer to a presence passing just beyond the edge of sight, and Elias felt it settle into him the same way the bracelet had earlier, quiet, certain, and as the night stretched deeper and the stars began to show overhead, he realized that the choice he had made that morning had not ended with the sisters walking away. It had opened something that moved beyond the boundaries of his land, beyond the reach of his control, and for the first time in a long while, Elias Boone did not feel the need to close that door. He let it stay open, even if he did not yet know what would come through it. Because out here, the land had its own way of answering a man's choices, not with words, not with immediate consequence, but with time, and Elias had the sense that time was already moving toward him, slow, steady, and impossible to turn away. The night did not end the way most nights did. It did not settle into silence and stay there. It shifted, slowly, almost carefully, like something unseen was moving along the edge of Elias Boone's land without ever stepping fully into it. And Elias felt it the same way a man feels a change in weather before the clouds arrive, not with his eyes, but somewhere deeper, somewhere that had learned to listen without sound. He sat on the porch a long time, longer than usual, his hand still resting near his pocket where the bracelet lay, and every now and then his fingers would brush against it without him realizing, as if confirming it was still there, still real. And the longer he sat, the clearer that quiet presence became, not threatening, not urgent, just there, like the land had gained a memory it had not carried before. And sometime past midnight, when the stars were high and the air had cooled enough to carry every small sound across the open ground, Elias finally stood, not because he had decided anything, but because the waiting had reached a point where standing felt more honest than sitting. He stepped off the porch, boots pressing softly into the dirt, and he walked a few yards out into the open, stopping where the land dipped just enough to catch the faintest outline of movement against the horizon. And that was when he saw them, not clearly, not in detail, just shapes, distant figures standing still at the far edge of his land, too far to make out faces, too still to be passing through, and Elias did not call out, did not raise a hand. He simply stood there, meeting that distance with his own stillness, because whatever this was, it was not meant to be broken by noise. Time passed, slow, stretched, the kind of time that makes a man aware of every breath he takes, and the figures did not move closer, did not turn away. They remained where they were, watching, not like hunters, not like men looking for something to take, more like witnesses, and that realization settled into Elias with a quiet certainty. This was not about what had happened that morning anymore. This was about what it meant, what it said, what it changed. The wind moved across the space between them, carrying nothing but the scent of dry earth and distant sage, and for a brief moment, Elias felt something he had not felt in years, not loneliness, not exactly, something closer to being seen, not judged, not measured, just seen, and he did not know if that was a good thing or not, but he did not turn away from it either. The figures remained until the first hint of dawn began to touch the horizon, a faint line of light that slowly pushed back the dark, and as that light grew, the shapes at the edge of his land began to fade, not moving, not retreating, just dissolving into the brightness of the morning, until they were gone, leaving nothing behind but the memory of their presence. And Elias stood there a moment longer, letting the day begin around him, the sounds of the land returning one by one, the distant call of a bird, the shift of wind through dry grass, the quiet rhythm of a world that did not pause for any one man's choices. And yet something had paused, something had taken notice, and that was not something Elias could ignore. He turned back toward the cabin slowly, the light now strong enough to reveal the familiar lines of his land, the fence posts, the water barrel, the worn path leading to the door, everything exactly where it had always been, and yet not the same, not after what had passed through it. He stepped onto the porch, the boards greeting him with their usual creak, and he paused there, his hand moving once more to his pocket, feeling the shape of the bracelet inside, and this time, he took it out, holding it up in the early light, the beads catching just enough of the sun to reveal their color more clearly now, the red deeper than he had noticed before, the blue brighter, almost alive in the way it reflected the morning sky, and Elias turned it slowly between his fingers, studying it again, not for what it was made of, but for what it represented, a choice made without witness, and yet somehow seen, a freedom given without expectation, and yet somehow returned, not as a debt, not as a reward, but as something else, something that did not fit into the simple ways men like him had learned to measure the world. And as he stood there, the bracelet warm in his hand, Elias Boone realized something that settled deeper than any thought he had had in years. The land had not just watched him. It had answered, not with force, not with demand, but with presence, with acknowledgement. And that kind of answer did not come often, not out here, not in a world where most things were taken or traded or lost. And Elias knew, without needing anyone to tell him, that whatever had stood at the edge of his land that night was not the end of this story. It was only the beginning of something that would not be rushed, something that would come in its own time. And when it did, it would not ask for permission. It would simply arrive, the same way everything else out here did, quiet, certain, and impossible to ignore. The morning did not rush. It unfolded slowly across the land, the way it always had. But Elias Boone could feel the difference in it, not in the light, not in the wind, but in the way everything seemed to carry a quiet weight now, like the land itself had taken a breath and was holding on to it just a little longer than before. He stood on the porch with the bracelet still in his hand, turning it once more between his fingers before slipping it back into his pocket, not out of habit this time, but with intention, and then he stepped down into the open ground, the dirt firm beneath his boots, the same ground he had walked 1,000 times without thinking. But today, every step felt noticed, not by others, but by himself, and that alone was enough to change the way a man moved. The sun climbed higher, warming the air, bringing life back into the quiet spaces of the land. And Elias moved through his morning with the same steady rhythm he had always known, checking the water, walking the fence line, tending to the horses, but his attention did not drift the way it used to. It stayed with him, present in each motion, in each small task. as if he understood now that even the simplest things held meaning when a man chose to see it. And as the hours passed, the memory of the night did not fade. It settled, deeper, quieter, like something that no longer needed to be questioned, only understood. And sometime near midday, when the heat began to rise off the ground in slow, wavering lines, Elias paused near the far edge of his property, the same place where he had seen those distant figures before, and he stood there for a long moment, not expecting to see anything, not searching, just acknowledging the space for what it had been and what it might become again. The wind moved across the open land, carrying nothing unusual, no sound of movement, no sign of presence, just the steady breath of a place that had returned to its usual rhythm. And Elias nodded slightly, not to anyone, not to anything visible, just a quiet recognition that whatever had come and gone had done so on its own terms. And that was enough. He turned back toward the cabin, his pace unhurried, his mind steady, and for a while, the day passed as it should, simple, quiet, uneventful. But as the sun began its slow descent once more, painting the land in long shadows and soft light, something shifted again, not sudden, not sharp, just a change in the way the air carried itself, and Elias felt it before he saw it, the same way he had the night before, a presence, distant but certain, and when he looked up toward the horizon, he saw them again, not the same shapes. Exactly, not the same arrangement, but the same stillness, the same quiet observation from the far edge of his land. And this time, there was no question in his mind about what it meant. This was not curiosity. This was acknowledgement, and Elias did not step forward, did not wave, did not call out. He simply stood there, meeting that distant line with his own steady presence. Because whatever connection had been formed between this place and those watching it did not need to be spoken. It existed already. And as the light faded slowly into evening, the figures remained, not moving closer, not retreating, just holding their place in the distance. And Elias found himself doing the same, standing there longer than he needed to, longer than habit would have kept him, but not out of caution, out of understanding, because some things were not meant to be rushed or questioned. They were meant to unfold, slowly, in their own time. And as the first stars began to appear once more in the darkening sky, the figures faded again, just as they had before, leaving behind nothing but the quiet certainty that this was not over, that something had begun that did not belong to one moment or one choice, but to something larger, something that moved beyond a single day or a single man. And Elias Boone stood there in the fading light, his hand resting once more near the bracelet in his pocket, and for the first time in years, he did not feel the need to return to the safety of his old way of living, the quiet, the distance, the separation from everything beyond his land, because now, that separation was gone, not broken, but opened, and what lay beyond it was no longer something to avoid. It was something to face, not with force, not with fear, but with the same quiet certainty that had carried him through the choice he had already made. And as the night settled in once more, Elias turned back toward his cabin, not to retreat, but to wait, because he understood now that whatever was coming next would not arrive with warning. It would arrive the same way everything else had, quietly, steadily, and when it did, he would be ready, not as the man he had been before, but as the man he had chosen to become. The next morning came quieter than the one before, not because the land had changed, but because Elias Boone had, and that difference settled into everything he did, the way he stepped out onto the porch, the way he looked across the open ground, the way his hand rested briefly over the bracelet in his pocket, as if it had become part of his routine without him ever deciding it should. The horizon stretched wide and empty, no figures, no movement, just the steady rise of heat from the earth as the sun climbed higher, and for a moment, it would have been easy to believe that whatever had begun had already passed, that the night had been nothing more than a quiet echo of something that did not belong to daylight. But Elias did not believe that, not anymore, because he had learned something in the stillness of those hours, learned that not everything showed itself when the light was strong. Some things waited, not out of fear, but out of purpose. And purpose did not rush. He moved through his morning as he always had, but with a different kind of attention, not looking for change, just aware of it. And as the sun reached its highest point and began to lean slowly toward afternoon, the land held its silence in a way that felt almost deliberate, like it was giving him time to settle into the choice he had made, time to understand it without distraction. And Elias took that time without realizing he was doing it, his steps steady, his thoughts quiet, until the moment shifted again, subtle at first, the kind of shift a man might miss if he had not been listening for it, a faint movement along the edge of his land, not distant this time, not hidden in shadow, but closer, measured, and when Elias turned his gaze toward it, he saw them, not the same distant figures from before, not a line across the horizon, but a small group, standing just beyond the boundary of his property, close enough to be seen clearly now. 3 figures, still, composed, not advancing, not retreating, and for a long moment, neither side moved, because this was not a moment for motion. This was a moment for recognition, and Elias stepped forward slowly, not closing the distance entirely, just enough to meet it halfway. His boots pressing into the dirt with that same quiet certainty he had carried through everything since the morning the sisters had arrived. The figures did not react, did not shift. They remained where they were, watching, not with suspicion, not with challenge, something else, something that felt like acknowledgement, and Elias stopped a few yards from them, the space between them open, unclaimed, and for the first time since this had begun, one of them moved, not forward, not back, just a small step to the side, revealing what had been held behind them, a bundle, simple, wrapped in cloth, resting on the ground, and Elias did not need to ask what it was, because he understood the gesture without explanation. This was not an offering in the way the town had used that word. This was not a trade, not a debt. It was something else, something that existed outside the rules he had spent his life following. The figure who had moved stepped back again, returning to stillness, and the space remained open, waiting, and Elias stood there for a moment longer, feeling the weight of what was being placed before him, not heavy, not pressing, just present. And then he stepped forward, closing the distance the rest of the way, his movements calm, unhurried, and he crouched down near the bundle, his hands resting on his knees as he studied it before touching it, because some things deserve that kind of pause, that kind of respect. He reached out slowly, unfolding the cloth just enough to see what lay inside, and his breath settled deeper in his chest as he took it in. Not surprise, not confusion, something closer to recognition, because what he saw was not something new. It was something familiar, something that connected back to the choice he had made without needing words to explain it. And Elias sat there for a moment, the cloth still in his hands, the figures standing quietly behind him, and the land stretching wide and open around them. And in that moment, the line between what had been his life before and what it was becoming now felt clearer than it ever had, not divided, not broken, just expanded. And when he finally stood again, folding the cloth carefully, not as a possession, not as a claim, but as something received, he did not look for approval, did not look for confirmation, because he already knew what this meant, not in words, not in explanation, but in the quiet understanding that had been building since the moment he chose to step aside and let something go that was never meant to be held. And as he turned slightly, the figures were already beginning to step back, not leaving quickly, not disappearing, just returning to the distance in the same steady way they had come. And Elias Boone remained where he was, the bundle in his hands, the bracelet in his pocket, and the quiet certainty in his chest that whatever had begun here was not about what had been given or taken. It was about what had been chosen, and choices like that did not end. They carried forward, shaping everything that came after, whether a man was ready for it or not. And Elias knew now that he was. The bundle did not feel heavy in Elias Boone's hands, but it carried a weight that had nothing to do with what it held inside. And he knew that before he even stepped back onto his porch, before he even unfolded the cloth the rest of the way, because some things announced themselves without needing to be seen, they settled into a man the moment they were accepted, and Elias had accepted this the second he reached for it, not out of curiosity, not out of need, but because turning away now would have meant turning away from the choice he had already made, and that was not something he was willing to do again, not after all these years. He placed the bundle carefully on the porch rail, the same place where the bracelet had been left, the same place where something small had first shifted the course of his life. And he stood there for a moment, his hands resting lightly on the edge of the wood, looking down at the folded cloth like it might speak if he gave it enough time. But it did not. It simply waited, the way everything out here seemed to wait, for a man to decide what it meant. And Elias exhaled slowly, the air leaving his chest steady, controlled, and he unfolded the cloth fully this time, not rushing, not hesitating either, just allowing the moment to reveal itself. Inside was a small collection of things, simple, deliberate, each one placed with care: a strip of dried herbs tied with thin thread, a carved piece of wood shaped into something that looked like a bird in flight, and beneath them, wrapped separately, a second bracelet, different from the one he carried. This one lighter in color, the leather softer, the beads arranged in a pattern he did not recognize but could feel carried meaning all the same, and Elias did not reach for it right away. He let his eyes take it in first, the way a man studies something before deciding whether it belongs in his life. And what he felt in that moment was not ownership, not obligation, something quieter, something closer to being trusted, and that realization settled into him deeper than anything else had so far. Because trust was not given lightly out here, not between strangers, not between people who lived on opposite sides of a line drawn long before either of them had a say in it. And yet here it was, placed in his hands without condition, without demand, and Elias understood then that what had begun was no longer just about him. It was about something larger, something that moved between people without needing to be spoken. He picked up the second bracelet slowly, turning it in his fingers the same way he had the first, feeling the difference in it, the lighter touch, the softer weave, and for a brief moment, he considered what it meant to keep both, what it meant to carry something that had been given freely, not as a possession, but as a connection, and that thought did not sit wrong with him. It did not feel like taking. It felt like holding on to something that was meant to be remembered, and Elias Boone had spent too many years forgetting the things that mattered. The porch creaked softly beneath him as he shifted his weight, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the ground. And for the first time since this had begun, he allowed himself to sit again, not out of habit, but because the moment called for stillness. He placed the second bracelet beside him on the rail, not putting it away, not claiming it yet, just letting it rest where he could see it, and he leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting out across the open land, the same land that had felt empty not long ago, but no longer did. Now it felt connected, not crowded, not occupied, just shared. And that was a feeling Elias had never known before, not out here, not in a life built on distance and separation. The wind moved across the porch again, lifting the edge of the cloth, carrying the faint scent of the herbs with it, and Elias recognized it without knowing why. Not the exact plant, not the exact use, but the intention behind it, something meant to protect, something meant to guide. And he let that understanding settle without questioning it, because not everything needed to be explained to be real. The light began to fade once more, the sky shifting into the deep colors of evening, and Elias remained where he was, not moving to prepare for the night the way he usually would, not yet, because something in him understood that this day had not finished saying what it needed to say. And as the shadows grew longer and the land grew quieter, he heard it again. Not the distant presence from before, not the unseen watchers at the edge of his land, something closer this time, something that stepped into the space between distance and arrival. And Elias did not turn right away. He let the sound come to him, the soft crunch of footsteps on dry ground, measured, unhurried. And when he finally looked up, he saw her, the taller sister, standing at the edge of his porch, not waiting at a distance, not watching from afar, but here, present, real, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because this was not a moment that needed to be filled with words. This was a moment that existed because of everything that had already been said without speaking. And Elias sat there, his hand resting near the second bracelet, his eyes meeting hers, and in that quiet exchange, something settled into place, not a conclusion, not an ending, something else, something that felt like the beginning of a different kind of understanding. One that did not ask for anything, did not demand anything. It simply existed, the way the land did, steady, patient, and real. She did not step closer at first, and that distance between them felt different from all the others that had come before, not uncertain, not cautious, but deliberate, like she understood exactly where to stand for the moment to hold its meaning. And Elias Boone did not rise from his chair, did not reach for anything. He simply remained where he was, his posture steady, his hands relaxed, because whatever this was, it was not something to be met with movement. It was something to be met with presence. The light of the late evening rested softly across the porch, catching in her hair, outlining her figure against the dimming sky. And for a moment, she looked less like someone who had returned and more like someone who had always belonged to the land beyond his fence line. Something that moved through it without leaving a mark, and Elias found himself noticing that not with curiosity, but with a quiet respect he had not felt before. She glanced briefly at the bundle on the rail, then at the second bracelet resting beside him, and her eyes lingered there for a second longer than anything else. Not questioning, not explaining, just acknowledging that he had seen what had been left, that he had understood enough not to discard it. And that was enough. She stepped forward then, one measured step onto the edge of the porch, her boots making almost no sound against the wood. And Elias could feel the shift in the air again. Not tension, not expectation, something steadier, something that settled rather than pressed. And when she spoke, her voice carried that same quiet certainty. "You did not take it as a reward," she said, and it was not a question. And Elias shook his head once, slow. "No," he answered, and the word did not need anything more. It carried everything that had led to this moment. She nodded slightly, as if that answer confirmed something she had already known, and for a moment, her gaze drifted past him, out toward the open land, where the horizon had already begun to fade into the deeper colors of night. And when she looked back, there was something else in her eyes now, not distance, not caution, something closer to recognition, as if the line that had separated them before had not been erased, but understood, and that made it no longer something that needed to be crossed. She moved closer to the rail, her hand reaching out to touch the second bracelet lightly, not picking it up, just brushing her fingers across it, and the motion was careful, almost reverent, like it carried more meaning than the object itself. "This one," she said quietly, "is not given to be worn lightly." And Elias watched her hand, the way it rested there for a moment before pulling back, and he understood that too, not in detail, not in tradition, but in the weight of it, the same way he had understood everything else that had come to him without explanation. "Then I will not wear it that way," he said, and his voice carried no promise, no oath, just a simple truth, and that seemed to be enough. She stepped back slightly, not leaving, just creating space again, the same careful balance they had held since the beginning, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to say that would add to what had already been done. The land around them settled deeper into night, the last light fading completely, leaving only the quiet presence of the stars beginning to show overhead, and in that darkness, the world felt both smaller and wider at the same time, like the space between people could shrink without closing entirely. And Elias felt that in the way he remained seated, not rising to meet her, not stepping away either, just holding his place in a way that felt right. She turned slightly then, her gaze shifting once more toward the horizon, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer, not weaker, just quieter. "My sister will not return," she said, and there was no sadness in it, no regret, just a statement of fact. And Elias nodded once, because he had already understood that in the way the day had unfolded, in the way some paths did not circle back, she chose her road, he said, and she looked back at him, her expression unchanged, but her eyes holding something that might have been agreement. "As did you," she replied, and that settled between them with a weight that did not need to be explained, because it was true in a way that went beyond the moment, beyond the day. It was something that had been set in motion the second he chose to step aside instead of claim what had been placed in front of him. And as the silence returned once more, deeper, now, fuller, Elias Boone realized something that did not come to him as a thought, but as a quiet certainty. This was not about what had been given or what had been taken. It was about what had been allowed to remain free, allowed to return, allowed to exist without being turned into something else. And that kind of allowance was not something he had ever understood before. Not in a life built on taking what was needed and leaving the rest behind. She took one last look at the bracelet, on the rail, then at him, and without another word, She stepped down from the porch, her movements as quiet as they had been when she arrived, and she walked back toward the open land, not hurried, not lingering, just moving forward in the same steady way she had always carried herself. And Elias did not call out, did not stop her, because this was not a moment that needed to be held onto. It was one that needed to be let go, the same way everything else had. And as her figure disappeared into the darkness, blending into the land that had always been hers, Elias remained where he was, the second bracelet resting beside him, the first one still in his pocket, and the quiet certainty in his chest stronger now than it had ever been. Because he understood at last that what he had done was not an act of giving. It was an act of not taking, and out here, that made all the difference. The night settled deeper after she left, not heavier, not darker, just fuller, like the land itself had accepted something that had been waiting a long time to arrive. And Elias Boone remained on the porch long after her footsteps had faded, long after the last trace of movement disappeared into the horizon, because this time, the quiet did not ask anything of him. It did not press. It did not test. It simply stayed, steady and certain, the way truth does when a man finally stops running from it. His hand rested near the second bracelet, his fingers brushing lightly against it without lifting it, not out of hesitation, but out of understanding, because he knew now that not everything needed to be worn to be carried. Some things stayed with you whether you held them or not. The stars stretched wide overhead, filling the sky in a way that made the world feel both endless and contained, and Elias leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze drifting upward, not searching for anything, just taking in what was already there. And for the first time in a long while, he did not feel alone in that space, not because someone stood beside him, not because voices filled the air, but because something inside him had shifted, something that no longer needed distance to feel safe. The wind moved gently across the porch, softer now, carrying the faint scent of the herbs that still rested in the folded cloth beside him, and Elias let that scent settle into him, the same way everything else had, without question, without resistance, because the need to question had faded, replaced by something quieter, something steadier. And as the hours passed and the night deepened, Elias Boone understood something that did not come as a thought, but as a feeling that settled into his bones, the kind that stays long after the moment that brought it has gone. He had spent years believing that a man kept his peace by holding on, by claiming what came his way, by building walls strong enough to keep the world from reaching him. But standing here now, with nothing in his hands that had not been freely given, with nothing around him that he had taken from another, he realized that peace did not come from holding on. It came from knowing when to let go, and that truth did not make him weaker. It did not leave him empty. It did the opposite. It filled the space he had kept guarded for so long with something that did not need protection, something that did not need to be defended, the kind of thing that could not be taken because it had never been owned in the first place. The horizon remained quiet through the night, no figures returning, no presence watching from the edge of his land. And yet Elias did not feel that absence as a loss, because he understood now that what had come and gone had not been meant to stay. It had been meant to show him something, to leave behind something he could carry forward in his own way. And as the first light of dawn began to touch the edge of the sky once more, Elias rose from his chair, his movements slow, deliberate, not out of age or weariness, but out of respect for the moment. He picked up the folded cloth, tying it carefully the way it had been when it was given, not altering it, not claiming it, just keeping it as it was. And he held the second bracelet in his hand for a moment before placing it back on the rail, not leaving it behind, not rejecting it either, just letting it rest where it belonged for now. Because he knew that some things revealed their purpose over time, not all at once. The sun began to rise, casting light across the land in long, steady lines, and Elias stepped down from the porch, the dirt beneath his boots firm and familiar, but no longer something he stood apart from. Now it felt like part of something larger, something that extended beyond his fence line, beyond his control, and that no longer troubled him. It grounded him, and as he walked out into the open ground, the same place where everything had begun, he paused, looking out across the horizon where the land stretched wide and endless. And he did not look for anyone, did not expect anything to appear, because he understood now that what mattered was not what came next, It was what had already been chosen, and that choice would carry forward whether he saw its path or not. The wind moved gently across the land, lifting the dust just enough to catch the morning light, and Elias Boone stood there, quiet, steady, a man who had been given something he had not taken, and in doing so, had gained something no one could ever hand to him. Not a reward, not a debt, not even a gift, something else entirely, something that could only be found in the moment a man decided who he was going to be when no one was watching. And as the day began again, Elias turned back toward his cabin, not to retreat, not to return to the life he had known before, but to live the one that had quietly begun the moment he chose. To let two lives walk free, because out here, in a land that remembered more than it spoke, that kind of choice did not end. It stayed, it grew, and it followed a man wherever he went, not as a burden, not as a shadow, but as something steady, something true, something that did not need words to be understood.